Discover the Our MedTech Lives podcast, where industry experts share their career stories, key achievements, and insights into overcoming challenges in the MedTech field. Hosted by Zilko Rima and Kash Ikram.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Our MedTech Lives. Today we are delighted to have Professor Brian D. Smith, who is a UK-based academic and a consultant and an author specializing in strategic execution within life sciences, pharma, and medtech and diagnostics. He's been a visiting adjunct professor to the SDA Bocconi School of Management in Milan, also the Open University in the UK, and he also runs his own consulting firm called Pragmatic Limited, and focuses on helping life science companies design and execute their strategies. And you may already know him because he's published hundreds of articles and books on strategy and marketing in the business of pharma and medtech, including leadership in life sciences, including The Future of Pharma, and my go-to book, which I always go to when I have to do a marketing plan, is Brand Therapy, 15 Techniques for Creating Brand Strategy in Pharma and MedTech. In fact, I was speaking to someone today and I recommended your book, Brian.
Thank you.
Without further ado, welcome to Our MedTech Lives.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's good to see you.
Professor Smith, you hold degrees in chemistry, in marketing, and in management. That would have opened up many opportunities for you. Why did you choose the pharmaceutical and medtech sectors?
Well, I stumbled into life sciences by accident when I was a very young man, straight from school, really. I'd always had a passion for science. I remember you have to remember that, when I was a small boy, 9 or 10, was when we had Apollo and the moon landings, and you've probably seen the Apollo 13 movie, right? Where they have to build that scrubber to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Well, I remember watching that when I was 9 or 10 years old and thinking, that is the coolest thing ever. And I always loved science. And when I left school, I joined an R&D lab, a pharma R&D lab, in fact. And it was just like being given the biggest chemistry set you could ever wish for, and I just loved it. And I was lucky enough to have a series of very good bosses, mentors who encouraged me and developed me. And I spent several years in R&D, pharma, then medtech. And then I went on a secondment into marketing, and theoretically for a 6-month secondment, I think it was supposed to be. With a company at that time, I was with a company called Smith & Nephew, and I think that was 40 years ago or something, and I'm still waiting for that 6 months to come and to end.
Excellent. So you started out as a chemist, right?
That's right.
And how has that shaped your view, coming from a chemistry area of pharma will be much clearer, but how did that shape your views on medtech coming from chemistry?
It's less relevant that I'm a chemist, the more relevant that I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. I think like a scientist. I explain things in scientific terms. I have that mindset, But when I worked in medtech R&D, I was, as a chemist working on polymers for wound dressings and things like that. I remember on one occasion, just a few years ago, I was at a congress, and I went to the exhibition stand, and all the stands, and then the reps on the stand, and there was a young man, I guess late 20s, on the stand, one of the sales reps. It was a quiet moment because all the doctors were in the congress, in the meetings. And he was attempting to detail to people a product that I had invented. And of course, he didn't know who I was. He just said Professor on my badge, and he probably thought I was a doctor of some kind. And so I started asking him questions about the product. And he'd been trained well, and he was a bright guy, but he couldn't possibly hope to know what I knew about the product, of course, And so
I see.
I gradually started cranking up the level of the questions and watching the poor guy squirm. But after a little while, I let him off the hook and explained that I'd helped invent this product and develop and bring it to market. But you could see the poor guy squirming when I was asking difficult questions about the nature of the polymer and stuff.
Wow. So, I mean, you're an expert when it comes to strategy in the pharma medtech area. So we've seen a lot of change in our business over the last decade. What changes do you think that company executives still underestimate, and why?
There are, in my work, I identify 6 great shifts in the environment. Do you remember that
Okay.
my research looks at our industry through an evolutionary lens, and essentially through that lens, firms are animals, and they group together. Similar firms group together with similar business models. They have the equivalent of species, and those species are simply adaptations to the environment. And so the 6 great shifts. And incidentally, if any of your viewers want to are interested, I'll give you an article that details these, a PDF that details these. But they include things like the globalization shift. So, for example, when I started in the industry, if you'd have talked about the industry outside of Western Europe and the US, people would have just looked at you like you were crazy. If I'd have told you that there were, Chinese or Indian companies that were being genuinely innovative, it just would have been incredible when I started the industry. So both supply and demand sides of the industry have globalized. Another example of one of those 6 great shifts is the value shift. When I started in the industry, innovation meant clinically better or medically better, technically better, and that decision was made by a physician. So all you had to do is invent a better product, take it to a doctor, and if it was better, the doctor would say, "Yes, I'll have it." But now, of course, yeah, it's a sweet old world.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the value is determined not just clinically or technically, but health economically. And that decision is not only made by doctors, but it's made by payers too. So that's called the great value shift. So how value is defined and by whom it is defined has shifted dramatically in the last decade or so. So those are examples of the great shifts in the industry. And what my work is about, my academic work, is studying how pharma and medtech business models adapt to those environments.
The name of your company is Pragmatic because you say that you are pragmatic about strategy. What does this word mean to you in the context of our industry?
Well, it's a portmanteau of medical, because I only work in medical markets. I don't do anything else. Don't ask me about selling cars or handbags or anything. I don't know.
I don't.
And I chose pragmatic because I got, in English we say I've got a bee in my bonnet. I've got an axe to grind. And my pet hate in life is people who, either academics or practitioners, executives, who view theory and practice as separate things. Okay, as if you hear people say, "Well, in theory this, but in practice that." That really gets my goat because it's tosh. There's a very famous saying in my business that there is nothing so practical as a good theory. And we believe that in science. I mean, our industry is science-based. And if I go to, I don't know, let's say if I go to a microbiologist, all of his work is based on germ theory. Right? If I go to a chemist, all of his or her work is based on atomic theory. Okay? If I go to a physicist, all of his work is based on laws of thermodynamics or gravitational theory or something. So all of our industry, we take theories and we apply them in practice because they're useful and practical and make sense. Whereas on the business side, we tend to disparage theory. The irony of that is, of course, that we use theory, executives use theory all of the time. The only difference between the two camps is that some of us realize that we're using theory and some of us do it unconsciously in there for that as well. I was in a meeting recently with a very senior executive, and he's a very blunt, hard-driving South African guy, very, no nonsense sort of guy. And he, although he was polite, he said to me, "Oh, I don't believe in all this theory nonsense. I'm a practical guy. I'm not interested in theory." And I said, "Really? So what did you spend your morning doing?" He said, "Well, in fact, this morning I was setting objectives for my team. SMART objectives, SMART, SMART objectives for my team." "Really?" I said. "So you are using Locke's goal setting theory, 1966. Would you like to see the paper?" We use theory all the time, and the point of calling my company pragmatic was that it's about applying academic theories, which are incredibly useful in practice, which you can do to great effect. That was the message I was trying to convey in the brand name, really. Because I think this whole idea that on the science side of a business, we use all the scientific theories to create the great advances that we do. And then on the business side, oh, no, theory, we don't like that stuff. We're practical people. It's nonsense. It's silly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm fascinated by this Darwinian concept that you just talked about a few minutes ago. So, when you talk about Darwinian evolution, you liken companies to being the organisms, they're clumping together in certain ecosystems. So, in Darwinian theory, concepts like fitness, right? What defines being fit for the environment you're in, and mutations also pops up. Does this appear in your work on companies?
One of the first things to understand, of course, Cash, is that in ordinary layman's English, the word evolution is used in 1,000 different ways. Okay,
right.
It has different meanings. But in my work, I mean, that's right. I mean, in the Darwinian sense, which is, Darwin said that in a population you get variation. Some of those variations are selected for or against by the environment, and the ones that are favored by the environment multiply and expand, and that leads to new species. So that's the sense in which I see it. So we have, our industry is essentially a population of companies. They vary in their strategies and their tactics and their structure and how they go to market and what market. They vary in all kinds of different ways. And the market likes some of those things and the market doesn't like some of those things. And it leads to speciation. So my work suggests that there's something like 26 different business models now. It's most obvious in pharma, but it's true in MedTech too.
Right.
If I took you back 40 years and we looked at the pharmaceutical industry, there was basically one model. Companies did R&D, they invented new drugs, they took them to market, and off they went. But if I now take you to that industry and show you companies like, if I compare, say, Roche and say Sun Pharma in India, you wouldn't for a second say they're the same business model, would you?
Right. No.
And we could say the same with what say a company like Illumina in diagnostics does, compared with say some of the companies doing medical disposables are doing. They're all MedTech, they're all med devices or whatever you call, but they're not the same business model. They have different strategies, different structures, different capabilities, and so on. And you can drill down further than that, because in the same way that in biology, the phenotypes that are selected for or driven by your proteome, and your proteome is driven by your genome. Well, in our industry, your phenotype is driven by your capabilities. What in my work I call the capabiliome, and that is your capabiliome is an expression of the little organization routines that operate in your company, which we call the routinome. So there are very close parallels, and that allows you to pick up ideas that we know from Darwinian evolution about how firms adapt and apply them in our industry. The big difference, of course, is that the variation, the mutation that you see in biology is more or less random, whereas in business, in a company, those variations are deliberate. You know, a leader will say, we're going to try and do this, or we're going to try and do that, or we're going to change in this way. So
Right.
they're smart. They can use the ideas from Darwinian evolution to understand how to make better decisions and create stronger strategies.
Interesting.
You just compare different companies, and but you also research on how to localize global strategies. How can companies strike the right balance between global consistency and local responsiveness?
Well, the whole idea of globalization, and again, I've published a suite of articles on that, which I'll share with you if you'd like. But I mean, you've got to start by having a strong core strategy. You can't adapt what isn't understood. Right?
Mhm.
So you know, quite often I'll see HQs complaining about the affiliates not adapting to local environment well. So it's because they don't know what you're doing in the middle, in the center. So it starts with being clear about your core strategy. The second thing then is the second step is then to understand your local market environment well, because if you're going to adapt your core strategy to the local market environment, you have to know what you're adapting to. And then the third step there is about understanding how adaptation works, because it's perfectly well to say, for example, the market segmentation in this affiliate country is different, so therefore we have to adapt to it. But to do that, you have to have the capabilities to understand segmentation, to understand targeting of segments and creating a portfolio of targeted segments, and adapting the value proposition to be specific to segments. Now, those are all well embedded capabilities in the best companies, but in many companies, those capabilities are very weak. So you can't adapt if you don't have those capabilities.
Yeah. You said there's like you've identified 26 different strategies, right? For 26 different strategies to
No, I
work,
said
they have
26
to
different business models. Strategy
business
is
model.
one aspect of a firm's business model, but it's not. Strategy and business model are not synonymous. You know, a
Right.
business model includes
Okay.
things like strategy and structure and capabilities and so on.
100%. So do you think there needs to be a number of environments that can absorb those
Yeah,
26 business
each
strategies,
one of
right? All of
those
them go into.
each one of those
Yeah.
business models is indeed an adaptation to a particular environment.
Right.
Um, and part of the reason that speciation happened was because of these 6 great shifts that I talked about earlier. You know,
Yeah.
so to take the example of that value shift, okay, given that value is now defined much more tightly and by different people, you've essentially got a choice, haven't you? You can either be very cheap, you know,
Yep.
generics and me too's and copies and biosimilars, or you can be very, very good. And there are a number of ways
Yeah.
you can be very good. And that's a speciation split, if you like. Okay. Um, um,
Yeah.
but equally, what you can't be is for what biologists call the fitness trough. So if you try to be how many medtech companies feel is they try to be a bit better than the competition, but not fantastic. And they
Right.
try to be, or they try to be a bit cheaper than competition, but not very cheap. Okay?
Right.
And they fall between those two peaks. Right? So the customers who want very good buy very good, and customers who want very cheap buy very cheap, and nobody buys stuff that is okay but not very cheap.
Yeah. In the middle. You never want to be in the middle,
That's
right?
right. That's
That's
right. That's right.
that's always and so with all these different business models, how do you as an academic decide where you're going to focus, which ones you're going to study?
Well, I study the phenomenon of speciation. Okay,
Right.
so and in particular, more recently, my work has been concentrating on the practical implications of that at a adaptation level. So how is it that you can adapt to this environment, not adapt to that environment? What capabilities, skills, and so on do you need? So just to go back to the example that I gave a moment ago, if your market has segmented, okay, then you need a strong capability of internal capability. Your brand team would need to know how to do segmentation, for example.
Right.
And yet many of the companies I deal with, I ask them what the segments are, and they don't tell me segments. They tell me categories. So they'll say it's big hospitals, or they'll tell me it's a disease category or something like that. Those are not segments; they're categories. So here I am talking to very well respected global companies whose market is segmenting, and they don't have basic segmentation capabilities, for example. So that's the area that I focus on. But remember that it's not a case of one business model is better than the other. Just like, if I took you to the rainforest and I pointed at a sloth in the trees and the piranha in the river, it wouldn't be that one species was better than the other. It's just that they adapted to fit that niche in the environment.
Yes, absolutely.
This point to question to add, has there ever been a trend you dismissed early on that later proved to be more important than you expected?
Let me think about that. There's a trend. There's one of the great shifts is what I call the systemic shift. So, we used to talk about diseases very simply and say, if we talk about cancer, for example, we talk about liver cancer and brain cancer and lung cancer and so on. And now, of course, we tend to refer to cancers by the genotype, for example. And I have to admit, 20 odd years ago, I remember thinking that might be interesting, but very nichey, not very relevant. And in fact, that specialization and personalization of medicine has become more important than I thought it would 20 odd years ago. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing, actually. I mean, if you look at what we do in the industry, we tend to spend more and more money on developing better and better treatments for fewer and fewer people, whilst at the same time leaving many of the big diseases or conditions not cured. Yeah. So I see all the time. We see companies working on devices and drugs for relatively minor aesthetic conditions, like frown lines or something, or on treatments which extend the life of cancer patients by a matter of weeks, for a large amount of money. And yet, we still can't manage diabetes well. And I'm sitting here with osteoarthritis in both my knees, and there's no, other than going under the knife, there's no cure for that,
Right.
And yet that affects millions and millions and millions of people, right? So, but it's a byproduct of, the fact that we live in a capitalist system, which I'm not against, okay? That, our innovation follows the money rather than necessarily the societal need.
Okay. So, following on your evolutionary theme, do you think that AI to our business is going to be like the asteroid was to dinosaurs?
No, it won't. It will have a big impact, but remember that AI is a general purpose technology. Okay, as they call it. It's like electricity was.
Yeah.
And I think we can learn lessons from electricity. Actually, for start, although it changed the nature of industry, it didn't give many firms distinct advantages because everybody got it.
Right.
And where the advantage came from is not in having electricity, but in working out how to use it.
Yeah. It's a good analogy.
And the companies that will win with AI will be the companies that are good at strategizing and building AI into their strategy, rather than, and the companies that will fail will want to just adapt AI because it's AI, right? It's like, 150 years ago, you decide to electrify your factory, but that doesn't help you if you don't have a strategy.
Right. And to this point, do you need to rewrite your business models, or is it just adaptation then when it comes to AI and digital?
You may not have to rewrite your business models to adapt to the environment, but AI is not the environment. AI is just one part of the environment. There are many parts of, so in one of those 6 great shifts I refer to is the information shift. Okay, it's not just about AI. It's about where we gather information from and how we process it and so on. So if your environment is changing, you have to change. You have to adapt your business model. Yes, but
Hmm.
but but just because AI is sexy and trendy and is getting all the headlines at the minute doesn't mean it will create a major change in every business environment. Okay?
Hmm.
Particularly, of course, if you and all of your rivals have it. Okay? It'll just become routine. In the end, we still have the situation where we have to identify what the customer wants, what is valuable in the eyes of the customer, and provide that value better than our competitors do, recognizing that in any market, typically different customers perceive value in different ways.
Yeah. There's always been this talk of merger of technologies between MedTech and the pharma, right? And it's always
Mm-hmm.
happened at a low level.
Mm.
Do you ever see that becoming,
Well, some business
like
models
MedTech
do
and
that.
pharma?
Some business
Yeah.
models have already done it. And, companion diagnostics is the obvious example of that. Right?
Okay.
Uh, um,
Tell
and
us
we're
about that.
seeing some of it. We're seeing some of it in the apps that manage chronic diseases and ensure
Mhm.
adherence and so on. So we're seeing some of it. Um, Arguably, it's happened less than you might expect. Okay?
Yeah.
I think I'm speculating now. I don't know this, but I suspect that a large part of the way that will happen in the future is the way that we, qualified medical advice has always and will always be in short supply,
Yeah.
um, and therefore costly. And as AI gets better and better at being your doctor,
Mhm.
um, it won't displace doctors, but it will across the whole market. But there will be a whole segment who turn to AI first and doctors second, and that
Yes.
will that will shape the market a lot.
We saw that with the introduction of Google, right? A lot of people were looking up and then going to their doctors and saying, "Oh, look, here's what I found on the internet," which
Yes,
annoyed
but they were
doctors a
using
lot.
it as a supplement to doctors. Okay, now,
Yes.
just in the future, and this is one of the business models I talk about in my work. In the future, I won't even bother going. People will not even bother going to the doctor. They will talk to AI and say, "Well, I can get a 95% good answer from AI at almost zero cost, or
Yeah.
a 99% answer, because doctors aren't always right, of course, a
Yeah.
99% right answer at high cost from a doctor. And then I can, particularly if it's a relatively minor ailment, okay, not a life-threatening ailment, then I'm quite happy to then go to Mark Cuban on the internet and buy my drugs cheaply there, or whatever, or do my own research, and instead of going through my relatively expensive health system here, I'll go and get my knees done in Turkey or something.
Right.
I think we are always talking about new technologies coming to the market. What do you think are the biggest barriers preventing faster adoption of new technologies? Or maybe you think it's too fast, can also be, right?
The biggest, the first thing I guess to say there is that the reason that most new medical technologies are not adopted, or not
Mhm.
adopted quickly or well, is because they're not very valuable in the eyes of the customer.
Hmm.
They are, you know, they are 5% better, but 50% more expensive. And in the situation that we're in, particularly in the West, in developed economies with aging populations and stuff, it's that health systems are looking at it and saying, that's not necessarily a smart way to spend your money, right? So
Yeah.
that's why many are not adopted. But let's assume that it genuinely is valuable. Okay, the issue then is more sociological than technological. I would argue it's more to do with most complex medical technologies are not these days adopted by a clinician; they're adopted by a community of practice. Okay,
Mm.
because it affects the standard of care and the care pathways and all kinds of professionals involved, and they have to agree together to adopt a new technology, because a new technology quite often means a new treatment pathway,
Yeah.
and that's a sociological process. Um, I've recently, one of my PhD students, Matthew, has recently completed his PhD, great PhD. And he looked at, the innovation and diffusion model of, early adopters and innovators and like that. He looked at that with regard to adoption of new medical technologies and found it to be, even though the industry talks in the language of that model all the time, they talk about key opinion leaders and laggards and stuff. He found that model in our industry is only half the story. It's not wrong, but it's only half the story. And he and I working together, I suppose, developed a new model called the true model of how new medical technologies are adopted, and which incorporates both that side of that Rogers diffusion of innovation model and the community of practice model and puts them together. And it appears to be a much better way to understand the uptake of new medical technologies. It's a great piece of work. I'm really proud of what Matthew did.
That sounds fascinating. So,
well, you
how
should
do
definitely try and interview Matthew sometime. It's a great piece of work.
Oh, definitely, you should connect us. I would love to do that.
I will.
Absolutely.
I'll do that.
So, how do you take? So it's a jump, right? So, how do you take the theoretical work, like what you did with Matthew, and then when you're in front of companies as pragmatic and you're bringing this academic work, how do you make it practical and real, and they can execute on it?
It's funny, I joke because quite often when I'm dealing with companies, they're used to dealing with consultancies, and the consultancy business model is based on process. Okay, that is, and it has to be, because typically what happens in a consultancy is they have somebody my age, some grey-haired guy comes in and sells you the project, and then a bunch of 25 will execute it, right? And to make that work, you have to have a machine, a model, right? So quite often a new client in particular will say to me, well, how does the process work? I'll say, well, I don't know yet, because I don't have a process. Right? What I have is a great big bucket of knowledge accumulated over decades. And I'm going to listen to what your problem is, try to work out what it is, and find out which bits of these knowledge are relevant and applicable to your situation, and I'll build a solution around them. So it's, you will of course hear all consultancies say that they do a bespoke approach, but basically they take a core model and they tweak it slightly for the client. Everything I do is like cooking from scratch, really.
Right. Oh, wow.
And how do you measure success? I mean, for us in sales, it's always easy, right? We measure the numbers. If they go up, you're successful. But maybe that's a little too simple for your work.
Is the client happy? Did the client get what they
Okay.
wanted? So, quite often at the beginning, I'll say to a company, so when this is all done, what will the world look like? How will the world be different? Okay. And they will say, for example, well, we're facing intense competition. We have some new technologies, but nobody's taking any notice of it. And we're being undercut by lesser, but cheaper technologies. And we will have by the end of this process, we'll have made a set of decisions about where we focus our efforts that has a high probability of delivering our business goals. Right? So, okay, that's the goal. So we'll work backwards someday as to how we do it. I suppose the other thing to say, of course, is that usually I co-create the value with the client, because I sometimes joke that this sort of work, you either hire a pair of hands or you hire heads, So quite a lot of consultants, when they're hired, the firm could do it for themselves. They just don't have the headcount. So they're using a consultant as really a sort of temporary employment agency. Yeah? I don't do that sort of work. The sort of work I do is where the client company does not have the knowledge that they need to do what they need to do. They might have the people, they might have the headcount, the numbers of pairs of hands, but they don't have the strategic knowledge as to how to do this. Okay, and I do. So they hire my brain, not my hands, really. And the corollary of that is that we they work together. We work together to implement what we're doing. It's not me doing the work for them and then handing it across to them.
I think that's great. I can see it as a challenge though, because you're a custom shop, right? You're not your garage that's doing a service. You're fixing bespoke stuff, but you must encounter, like the gentleman you mentioned earlier who says, "Oh, I don't believe in theories," right? So you're talking here, they're talking at cross purposes. How do you manage that situation?
Well,
It's got to be challenging.
it varies by situation, but for example, I'll say, so is your current approach solving your problem?
Yeah.
No. Okay. So let's think of examples where other pharma or medtech companies have faced similar situations and overcome them. Right?
Yeah.
How would you? And let's talk about how we explain those. Okay. And we'll talk through some examples and stuff. And it says, okay, well, you've explained it. Well, no, I haven't explained it. I've theorized it. Because in my work, the word theory simply means explanation. So when you say
Right.
you don't believe in theory, what you mean is you don't believe in, wild horse ideas that aren't proven. Okay. But you do believe in explanations. Everything you do, what you're seeking is an explanation for example, why company A succeeds and company B doesn't, or why that company that was in a similar situation to yours managed to succeed. And you want to understand that, you want to explain that so you can do something similar. And that's what I help them do.
Yes.
Theory is just another word for explanation.
I'm going to ask you a tough question.
Mm.
What do you find most fun, your academic work or your advisory work?
Well, you're begging the question. No, and I bet for people who are listening to this who aren't native English speakers, Cash, I better explain. As you know,
Yeah.
the phrase begging the question, it does not
Yeah.
mean asking the question. It means
No.
asking the question in a way that assumes its premises. Okay?
Yes.
So if I say to you, Cash, are you still beating your wife? Okay? I'm
Yes, on a regular basis.
yeah.
That's just
I'm
the other way around.
begging the question. So what you were doing when you ask which side I like best, you're assuming that they're separate entities.
Yes. Yes.
And
I just thought
and
the
they're
cat
not really.
amongst
They're so closely intertwined. So
yes.
the research I do and the writing I do and the consultancy work I do are all about how pharma and medtech firms compete in a changing environment. Now,
Right.
they're just looking at it from different. It's a little bit like, if you went to the CEO of a medtech company and say, which do you think is the most important part of your company, the R&D or the marketing or the manufacturing?
Yes.
And he'd look at you like you were stupid and say, well, if we didn't have all three, we couldn't operate, right?
Yes. I suspected that would be the answer, that you love both, which is why you do both, right? And if anyone's wondering, I don't beat my wife, so
Yeah,
just
yeah.
I was joking. Right?
It should be
The
should we come to
the,
another
the, jo-
topic before
yeah. the joke,
this
of course,
explodes?
my joke only worked
Yeah.
on the assumption that you didn't, of course, Cash. So,
Yes.
mm, mm.
So I'm trying to take
Could have
over.
been 10 open
Uh,
worms everywhere.
can we take a moment to
Mm,
talk about your career advice
mm,
for people who are listening
Yeah.
to this podcast? And I would like to divide it into parts. One is for new entrants. What would be your best career advice for someone who would like to start now in this environment and would like to have a career? And the second part of the question would be, which leadership capabilities do you believe are becoming non-negotiable for executives?
Um, okay, those are difficult questions. Let me take them separately. Um, for young people, I mean, I have 3 young adult daughters, so I'm forever doing it. In fact, the current book that I'm working on at the moment is about parenting and about how you use ideas from business school to help your children.
Right.
You have to find what both the market wants and you enjoy doing. Okay, so that's the first thing. So that match is the important thing, and that's difficult when you're young. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but you don't, when you're young, you don't really fully understand what you're good at compared to other people, and you don't really understand what the market wants, right? So that's good. But I suppose the other thing that I tell my kids, and I tell all my master's students who are, at the early stages of their career too, there are some fundamentals that you have to get right. Okay, so you need to be useful, you need to be reliable, you need to be sociable and easy to work with, and all of those things. So when I have a master's student who trots into my class half an hour late, I rip them apart mercilessly, and they look at me like, "Well, why is this important?" I said, you could be the most brilliant. Let's say you work in market access. You could be the most brilliant market access person on the planet, but if you don't turn up, you don't deliver on time, and you don't keep your promises, and you're not reliable, then I don't want you. Nobody will want you, because like a football player. We all know football players, don't we, who are brilliantly talented but had personal problems and just weren't always there on the match day, right? So what happens to them? So for young people, find that match between what you're good at and what the market wants, and but get the fundamentals right. Be useful, be reliable, be dependable, be there. For leaders, it's a different thing. I think the most important thing about the leadership, I wrote a book called Leadership and Life Sciences, and in the research for that, because I interviewed 30, or was it something, quite a lot of industry leaders. What was interesting in that is, as you know, there were hundreds and hundreds of books about leadership.
Yeah.
And my inspiration for writing the book was that they all talk, every one of them, although they may have different views on what leaders should do, they all take the view that leadership is leadership is leadership, whatever the situation. And I read all of those books and I thought, I'm not convinced that leading, say, a McDonald's or a Walmart with lots and lots of relatively low-paid, low-skilled people is the same as managing a big high-tech MedTech company, right? Stuffed full of really bright people.
Yeah. Smart.
So I'm not saying one is easier or better or worse than the other. Just I can't see it being the same job, right? So I interviewed these leaders, and I found that there were certain numbers of characteristics of our industry that made leadership in our industry different. Now, I'm not saying that all leaders in our industry behave the same, but a pattern did emerge. So in the leadership literature, you quite often see this polarization between the servant model, the leader is there to serve his people, right? Or the great man model, they're like this, they're like Steve Jobs, like he has the visionary leader and everybody follows him. And I had those models in my head when I was talking to these very successful leaders in our industry, and neither of them work in our industry. The truth is that our industry is so complex, okay, that no one man, unlike iPhones, okay, no one man can go, I have the vision, I understand it all, let's follow me, right? It's just, you can't do that. And similarly, there are so many different moving parts to a MedTech company or a pharma company, so many different specialities, everything from marketing and sales and market access and medical affairs and manufacturing and regulatory and R&D and early discovery and development and all of those things that if you just act as a servant, all those different bits just go off in different directions.
Yeah.
So what emerged was what I eventually in the book called the decisive facilitator model. Okay. So what leaders in our industry seem to do is they facilitate the excellence of all of these different functions. They make it possible for these functions to be excellent. That's half their job. But the other half is they crystallize that into a strategy and a way of working. So all these brilliant departments, the chief scientific officer, the chief regulatory officer, the chief manufacturing officer, all of those people are all brilliant, but they need someone to crystallize it all, bring it all together. A little bit like that, the metaphor that was in my mind, I remember being one of my interviews, was, remember when you were at high school chemistry and you dropped a crystal into a supersaturated solution and it all suddenly crystallized out, right? That's effectively what these leaders do. They crystallize out the brilliance of all the different functions. And that decisive facilitator model, with little variations, is, I think, the dominant model in our industry.
I love that. So they almost act like a catalyst. So you drop it in, and the organization grows from them. I totally agree with you. If you're running a pharma, MedTech, even like an aircraft company manufacturing aircraft, it's not one person with one vision. Off you go.
Yeah, but you see, it's interesting. You should choose that parallel. I mean, undoubtedly, if you're running Airbus, undoubtedly it is a complex operation. But probably 80% of the people you employ are engineers.
Yes.
Whereas, say, a medtech or a pharma company, you have a much more diverse range of expertise to manage.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that makes our industry interesting and difficult to manage and complex and so on.
So what stage? So let's say a leader comes into a medtech company. At what stage should they engage with someone like yourself, Brian, and Pragmatic? Should they employ you on a project basis, or should they just have you on retention and be talking to you on monthly, quarterly basis?
Both ways. I've worked both ways. The joke, there's an old joke among academics that if you laid all the professors in the world end to end, they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. So whenever you ask an academic student, the answer is always, it depends. So there are, if it's if the CEO has the capability, himself and his team, to implement, then they may not need me, but if they don't, they may need me. The situation in which I'm most called in is when they are confused. They can see everything that's going on. They're always, obviously I've never worked with an idiot. Okay, I only ever work with bright people, and they can see everything's going on, but it's hard for them to make sense of it.
Right.
And for the senior people as well, of course, they have the problem that they lack a sounding board to discuss it with, because there are some things you can't discuss with your subordinates, right?
Right.
And
if changes happen really fast, maybe you're out of date already.
Well, sorry, say that again.
If things are moving really fast, right? In the industry, what you grew up knowing or what you learned in the prior 2 decades could no longer be useful.
That may be true. Although our industry, compared to other industries, doesn't move that fast.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't change, but it doesn't move fast compared to, say, some aspects of consumer goods or some aspects of information technology. The thing the situation that is probably most common when I work with leadership of companies is this problem of, I can see all the bits of the problem, I just don't see how they all fit together.
Right.
And that relates back to the question you were asking earlier about using theory and practice, because the theories provide frameworks and models for helping to understand things.
Right.
In the same way, I was explaining this to one client once, and his background was he was an endocrinologist, right?
Okay.
And I was explaining it, and at one point in the conversation, you could see his eyes light up, and a little bulb came on above his head. And I said, he says, I now understand the model. The model I was explaining to him was something called Burrell and Morgan's congruency hypothesis model, and he suddenly got it, and he was delighted. He says, this reminds me of being at university and doing the induced fit model. Well, in the way that enzymes work,
Yeah.
and the substrate goes in, and we used to talk about the lock and key model of enzymes.
Okay.
And in
Yes.
fact, now we talk about the induced fit model, where the enzyme changes shape around the thing it's the substrate. And he says, I remember when that was explained to me, and it just came on like a light bulb. And now what you've just explained, Brian, it's just came on like a light bulb. Same idea, And it's those frameworks and ideas and concepts and theories that help the leaders make sense of the complexity of the situation they're in.
Yeah.
It's really, I remember really when I started doing my PhD, remember I'd been in the industry for 20 years by then, and I just left a fairly senior commercial position in a diagnostics firm. And I went back to university, and suddenly, with the help of a fantastic supervisor, discovered this literature and all of these really useful, important ideas and frameworks and concepts that only live in the academic literature and are hardly ever used by practitioners, by executives.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, this is so annoying. This is all really useful stuff, and I could have. Why didn't anybody tell me this stuff? Right?
Yeah.
And yet, and it was all. It's all hidden in the academic literature, which practitioners really read.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. I read something the other day, and this may be my final question, but I read something the other day that drug development is not kicking out as many new drugs as the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Is that true? Are we slowed down?
It goes up and down. It goes up and down. So,
Right.
but what remains true in drug development, of course, is that a tiny proportion of the drug ideas that are discovered reach the market. And that has huge implications because, of course, every drug that reaches the market, the money it has to pay for all the things that failed.
Yes. Yes.
Okay? And there's so that means that innovative drugs, and I think to some extent the same argument applies in MedTech, innovative products will always be very expensive if they've got to pay for thousands of failures, right?
100%.
So if we were really serious about how we want getting innovation to be low enough cost that everybody could have it and still be profitable for the companies, okay, then you have to fix that attrition problem. And we know how to do that. We know what things we have to discover and what science we have to fix to do that. The trouble is that it's a tragedy of the commons problem, because that's what fixing those problems would benefit everybody, and therefore no individual company wants to invest in those translational problems. It's the work of governments, and governments should spend more money on that. In fact, they either spend money on the wrong things, or, as is happening in the US now, they're not spending money on it at all. So that's a translational problem. I've talked about that in various things I've published.
I think you had a lot of advice for us today already. Thank you for this. But we still want to close with our traditional last question, which is, what are the 3 things you know now that you wish you had known then, and you define your then?
You mean professionally related as opposed to personally related, right?
Oh, it could
Up to you. We are very curious now.
Okay, well, given that I'm on my second marriage, there's an obvious one that springs to mind, but I will not go down there. Things that I knew. Again, I'm thinking of the things that I pass on to my daughters now. One thing is I mentioned earlier, the importance of the basics. Being reliable, showing up. Somebody once said to me early in my career, my boss said to me early in my career, something like, you're valuable because if you say something, it happens.
Yeah.
So that's important. And I don't think I realized that when I was 21. Something that I tell my daughters is about the balance of life. I tell my daughters that life is a three-legged stool, and that your job is to have a good life. And to be a good life, you need to have interesting work, you need to have good health, and you need to have good relationships. And I was certainly guilty in my 20s, and many of my master's students are guilty of this, where they think good life equals good career. Well, it's one of the legs of the stool, but it's not all of the legs of the stool. And a third thing that I know now, I think, and this probably applies particularly to me personally rather than general, but there are young people that are like me. In my energy and enthusiasm to get things done, I think I underestimated the importance of agreeableness, how well you get on with people and things like that. I remember having a personnel, an annual review with a boss once, and I was about late 20s, I guess, and it was a glowing review. I'd achieved all my objectives, I exceeded them, done really well, and we'd gone through all that. And at the end of it, I said to him, "Oh, so come on, Mike." I said, "I know how these things work." I says, we've done all the good bits. You have to tell me my areas for improvement, right? Tell me what I'm doing badly." And he was a lovely man. He is a lovely man, and very gentle. And he was obviously a little uncomfortable with that part of the process.
Yes.
And I saw him. I remember it vividly. He rocked backwards from one buttock to the other in his discomfort. That was his tell. You could tell when he was uncomfortable. He did that.
Yeah.
And he said, well, Brian says, Brian, you always get things done, but sometimes it would be better if you opened doors before you went through them. and what he meant was, in my impatience to make things happen, I would bulldoze things, right? And it would always get things done, but it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And later in my career, of course, I learned how to understand people's sensitivities. Another boss said to me, what I had to do is learn to understand human frailties. And because my feelings aren't easily hurt, and I'm not very sensitive and things like that, you forget that many people are.
Yeah. No, it's really good advice. I love that. Open doors before going through them. Leave a trail of broken doors behind you.
No, Mike, who I'm still in touch with, will now says, "Oh no, I'm sure I never said that." I don't remember saying that, but I do. Yeah. I remember vividly because it made me laugh. And to his credit, because he found a metaphor that both communicated his point without making me defensive.
Yes, 100%, 100%. I love it. Well, Brian, this has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, our industry, our industry is clearly so diverse in terms of the various different types of smart people that work in it. And you've just another example of how you can have a career in MedTech that's somewhat a little bit non-traditional from sales and marketing, etc. And we love that this perspective you brought to us. I think people should definitely look you up on Google Scholar and on Amazon as well, and look up some of your books. I mean, I have all of them. So
you can find me on LinkedIn. Everybody can find me on LinkedIn as well, of course.
And LinkedIn as well. And if they need advice from you and ideas, then you're always there. I know you've always been there when I've come to you and my colleagues as well. So we really, really appreciate you spending your time with us.
It's my pleasure. It's a
Thank you for tuning into our MedTech Lives. You have been listening to Zilka Rima and Kash Ikran. We're committed to bringing you insights and stories that inspire and inform the medical community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network.